It's late July, somewhere in the Roman prefecture of Illyricum. One of the Germanic warriors serving the emperor rests in the cool stream of a flowing river, seeking some respite from the sweltering heat that they had been enduring for the past couple of weeks. The gentle current made the moment blissfully relaxing, in spite of the monotonous buzz of the nearby camp. On the other side of the river, hiding in the bushes, several pairs of sharp eyes watched the scene, trying to measure the size of the enemy contingent. The battle that would define the balance of power in the Roman Empire was about to begin. This video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. If you've heard of the game Raid Shadow Legends and were curious to check it out, there's never been a better time. A free-to-play champion-based RPG set in the lore-steeped lands of Teleria, Raid Shadow Legends is about to kick off a month-long celebration of Halloween, including player tournaments, special fragment events, new champions, and just tons of rewards all around. What's more, there are big content updates on the horizon to close out the year. Of significant appeal is the rich lore of the setting. The land, factions, and numerous races are shaped by the events of the game, weaving a rich tapestry of the story of the world itself. It certainly says a lot when even orcs of the world are not necessarily the bad guys, but rather nomadic folk cast off their ancestral lands just trying to survive. A noteworthy member of the orc faction is Robar, a powerful attack champion and a stunning addition to any roster. Help support our channel and at the same time give yourself a huge head start in Raid. All you have to do is hit the link in the description or scan our QR code and you'll get an epic hero, 200k silver, 1 XP boost, 1 energy refill and 1 ancient shard so you can summon an awesome champion as soon as you get in-game. It's not often that you get to start your quest by getting loot. It is the second half of January 379. The tidings of the catastrophic defeat on the fields near Adrianople, where the Eastern Emperor Valens fell to Gothic swords, still echo to the far corners of the Roman world. The unexpected and troubling barbarian victory spurred the Western Emperor Gratian to swiftly appoint a new Augustus, who would take control of the East in these trying times. And so it was that a proven general from Hispania named Flavius Theodosius was elevated to the imperial authority. The new emperor of the East seemed to be quite a shrewd pick in the hour of this military emergency. Coming from a family with military traditions, Theodosius spent years participating in the campaigns on the Roman frontier in Britain, Gaul, and the Balkans. Such a background was especially valuable in the beginning of his reign, as a swarm of Gothic tribesmen that crossed the Danube a couple of years earlier roamed freely across the Roman provinces south of the river, greatly disturbing local economy and public order. Theodosius grasped the seriousness of this situation all too well, and since the blunder of his predecessor near Adrianople left the military potential of the East in tatters, Theodosius had to seek a new means to contain the Gothic problem as quickly as possible. He used limited assistance from Gratian and took up the slow, arduous process of rebuilding the local standing troops, which allowed his generals to at least attempt to suppress some of the Gothic incursions during the first 2 years of Theodosius's reign. The subsequent campaigns brought some minor victories, which proved useful for imperial propaganda. But the emperor knew that the sheer scale of the Gothic incursion could not be curbed by mere numbers which he simply did not have. The situation called for a more nuanced approach. Therefore, Theodosius began to sow internal divisions among the Gothic people, hoping to pull more hesitant groups to his side while attempting to overpower the remainder that were isolated all at the same time. We're not going to delve too deeply into details, but the emperor's plan was definitely not as easy as it sounded. It took a good few years and a lot of blood and sweat for Theodosius to reach an accord with the majority of Gothic chieftains. The conflict finally came to an end in late 382 when a peace treaty was declared, but its terms were largely unsatisfactory for the Romans. The Goths became Roman foederati and were allowed to settle lands between the lower Danube and the Balkan mountains. It was a novel agreement for the Romans, as entire clans were settled on imperial soil while retaining their autonomy and freedom from direct Roman administrative control. In exchange, the Goths agreed to assist Theodosius in his future campaigns as an independent contingent, while many of the Gothic warriors even came to serve directly in the imperial army. Peace was finally brought back to the dioceses of Dacia and Thrace. But peace is a fragile thing. From that point on, the settlement of the Goths within the imperial borders remained a persistent threat to the internal stability of the Roman state. Undoubtedly, the initial years on the throne were not a breeze for Theodosius, and yet more challenges loomed on the horizon. His western counterpart, Gratian, fostered significant opposition in the early 380s by pursuing unpopular policies and for alleged favoritism towards barbarian units in the Western army. Eventually, in mid-383, the border regions of Britannia rebelled and proclaimed their commander, Magnus Maximus, as the new emperor of the West. The sources suggest that initially Maximus was rather unwilling to challenge Gratian, but widespread support instilled within him enough ambition and confidence that he decided to cross the channel with loyal troops and lay claim to the imperial throne. At the time, Gratian was campaigning against the Alemanni tribes north of the Alps, and upon hearing of Maximus's landing in Gaul, did not linger and marched his army to challenge the usurper immediately. A series of skirmishes ensued in which many of Gratian's soldiers switched sides, and the emperor was forced to flee south. Maximus's cavalry pursued and managed to kill Gratian near Lugdunum. This act resulted in the western half of the empire falling under the nominal rule of Gratian's half-brother, 12-year-old Valentinian. One would expect that Maximus would maintain momentum and invade Italy, but instead he set up his court in the city of Augusta Treverorum and decided to secure his position in Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia before seeking more civilized ways to legitimize his rule. Developments to the west found Theodosius in no position to meddle, as he still lacked sufficient military strength and borders secure enough to risk a venture west. He was instead focused on a prompt recovery from the Gothic War, and thus the only viable option he had was to recognize Magnus Maximus as the third Augustus. The peace held for a few years, but as stated before, peace is a fragile thing, especially in the late Roman world. During this time, Maximus built up sufficient power to direct his ambitions towards Italy. When he heard the rumors that Valentinian's position in Milan had faltered, he decided to launch an invasion south to unseat the young emperor. This meant that the Roman Empire once again teetered on the verge of civil war. Upon learning that Maximus was about to cross the Alps with an army, Valentinian, still an inexperienced youth, immediately fled and requested assistance from his eastern counterpart. By the year 387, Theodosius had already braved the tumultuous early period of his reign and could offer a more meaningful response to the recent developments in the West. Valentinian and his court received shelter, but Theodosius seemed reluctant to help in fighting the usurper. It took him almost a year to make up his mind, throughout which he essentially made Valentinian his subordinate. At last, he was convinced to mount a campaign by Valentinian's mother, who orchestrated for the recently widowed emperor to marry her charming young daughter and to help the suffering family. The campaign started in June of the following year, when the imperial fleet with Valentinian aboard sailed out with the intention of making a landing in Italy. In the meantime, Theodosius received reports that Maximus's troops were spotted besieging the castrum of Emona, so he promptly set out to Illyricum to meet the enemy and sent a contingent under his trusted general of Frankish origin, Arbogast, to take a northern route to Maximus's capital in Gaul. Since the majority of Theodosius's army was of barbarian origin, consisting of Goths, Alans, and Huns, the allegiance of many of them could rather easily be altered with coin and promises. Although the emperor's authority kept most of these warriors loyal, the closer the imperial host got to the west, the more men from the eastern army defected to the usurper's side. But this was not the time for doubts. Theodosius's troops moved swiftly, and upon reaching the environs of Sicya, scout reports came in that Maximus's army was seen on the opposite shore of the Sava River, a couple of days' ride northwest. Taking advantage of the fact that a good portion of his troops were horsemen, Theodosius dispatched a sizable vanguard comprised of Hunnic, Alani, and Gothic cavalry and horse archers in the hope of a rapid attack on the unexpecting foe, while the remainder of the army steadily followed their path. After a long, tiring ride, in the late afternoon of the next day, Theodosius' mounted units reached the camping area of Maximus's troops and, seeing the ford barely guarded, spurred their foaming horses through the shallow streams of the Sava River to strike at the enemy and try to establish a foothold on the opposite bank. Hundreds of riders crossed the river virtually unopposed, raining arrows upon confused Gallic and Germanic warriors loyal to Maximus. His men were significantly more numerous, but the unexpected assault of Theodosius's mounted vanguard successfully disrupted any attempt to organize an effective defense of Maximus's fairly undisciplined footmen in order to withstand the attack. The skirmish lasted for a few hours, during which many Germanic and Gallic warriors fell, but it was not enough to break them. Suffering persistent losses, Maximus's units eventually managed to retreat as the summer sun set on the horizon. The Alans, Goths, and Huns serving the emperor were unable to annihilate the enemy, but gained a foothold on the western bank of the river. During the night, the rest of Theodosius's army caught up and proceeded to safely reach the western bank of the river. But before any further plans were made by the emperor, at first light of the next day, the usurper's regrouped troops launched a counterattack. The lines were formed, and this time a regular battle ensued. Although the primary sources leave us with no details of this clash, it was a peculiar spectacle of two predominantly barbarian masses in a brutal melee for domination of their own overlord, a rising hallmark of many armies of the late Roman period. The battle raged for a good portion of the day, but in the end, Theodosius's men, being better disciplined and organized, broke the enemy line and forced Maximus's troops to retreat. The usurper fled to the fortress of Aquileia, but before he was able to man the walls and prepare for a siege, Theodosius's forces stormed in and subdued the garrison. The emperor showed no mercy, and Magnus Maximus was beheaded on the 28th of August, 388, while his son and heir was executed by the emperor's general Arbogast in Trier, which concluded the civil war. The successful campaign and execution of Maximus left Theodosius as the single most powerful man in the empire, able to exert his authority in both parts of the Roman realm. But despite his undeniable achievements, the following years gave little respite for Emperor Theodosius, as another conflict that would set the future of the Western Roman Empire was taking root in the head of one of the emperor's most trusted generals.